One of the most common questions that I get asked is there a European fund similar to popular ETFs such as SCHD or VOO? And while there aren't exact copies of these funds, I have taken the time to do some research and found some funds that are very similar in nature. So in this video, I'm going to be revealing the European options for some of the most popular ETFs. I've compiled all of my findings into an easy-to-use spreadsheet. I'll be sending out this spreadsheet in 1 month for anyone who signs up for my free newsletter. Link is in the description to sign up. Now let's go ahead and jump into it. The first ETF we're going to be looking at is the Vanguard S&P 500 ETF, which is stock ticker VOO. This is probably one of the most popular ETFs out there in the market. And if we scroll down, we can see we're going to get a pretty good description of exactly what this fund aims to do. You can see right here, it seeks to track the performance of the S&P 500 index by using a full replication technique. Now, what does that mean? A full replication technique is basically where a fund manager buys every security that makes up an index at the same weights as the index. So for example, you can see they're replicating the S&P 500 in this scenario. So basically, if we scroll up and look at the holdings for VOO, if I scroll down, you can see basically what this fund does is it holds the top 500 largest companies in the United States. So basically, this fund just gives you exposure to 500 of the best businesses in America. Now, if we scroll up a little bit, we can see it has quite a bit of exposure to technology at almost 28 to 29%, healthcare coming in at around 13.2%, financials around 12%, consumer cyclical around 11%, and everything else a little bit under 9%. And if we jump over the summary and look at it historically speaking, this fund has performed extremely well, which is no surprise because the economy's done so well over the past 10 years. We can see 1 year up around 15.8%, over the past 5 years up around 47.69%, and the past 10 years up over 154%. Not to mention the fund does also have a small starting dividend yield currently sitting at around 1.58%. Now, something a lot of people love about this Vanguard fund in specific is the expense ratio. The expense ratio is nice and low, currently sitting at 0.03%. That means for every $10,000 you have invested into this fund, you will be paying $3 in expenses. So now let's get to the comparable European ETF for VOO. And if I jump over to Vanguard's website, you can see we have an ETF called VUAG. And if we scroll down, we can see a little bit more about this fund. It essentially tries to do the same thing as VOO. It employs a passive management or indexing investment approach, and it seeks to track the performance of the S&P 500 index. And again, keep in mind that index is comprised of large-sized companies in the United States. And if we scroll down a little bit further, we can actually see this is a relatively new ETF. It had a listing date of May 16th in 2019. Now, if we scroll up a little bit more, something else I want to point out is the expense ratio is actually slightly higher at 0.07%. That's basically double the expense ratio of VOO. So while it's still not very high, it is important to note it is slightly higher. The next ETFs we're going to be looking at are dividend focused, and the first is my personal favorite and one that makes up a large portion of my portfolio, and that is the Schwab US Dividend Equity ETF, SCHD. Now, there is another somewhat comparable dividend ETF similar to SCHD, and that is DGRO. These are two popular dividend ETFs in America that have a higher than normal starting dividend yield, but really have a phenomenal history of dividend growth over time. So for example, if we click back on SCHD, if we come over here and click on dividends, if we scroll down, we can see the 3-year dividend growth rate sitting at 11.4, the 5-year at 13.69, and the 10-year dividend growth rate sitting at 11.11%. So again, we've seen really phenomenal dividend growth from SCHD, and again, a really nice starting dividend yield sitting at 3.69%. Higher than normal starting dividend yield plus the dividend growth rates really makes it a powerhouse in the dividend investing community. And if we scroll down, we can learn just a little bit more about this fund, just like we did with VOO. And here we can see it does seek to track the performance of the Dow Jones US Dividend 100 Index by using, again, a full replication technique, which we just talked about. Let's go ahead and scroll back up and look at the European comparable. And the best comparable I found for these two funds was going to be GGRG, and this is the Wisdom Tree Global Quality Dividend Growth ETF. Here we can see the fund seeks to track the price and yield performance before fees and expenses of the Wisdom Tree Global Developed Quality Dividend Growth Index. If we scroll down, we're going to be able to get some more insight into this ETF. Now, the first thing that I will point out is, again, this is a fairly young fund. The inception date sitting on June of 2016, so again, a fairly young fund. Now, the expense ratio right here, this is something we need to point out. This is typically a little bit higher than I like to see it. It's sitting at 0.38%, meaning, again, for every $10,000 you have invested, it'd be around $38 of expenses. And if we compare that to SCHD, you can see their expense ratio only sitting at 0.06%. Now I know again this might not seem like a lot, but long term this can really make a difference in your long-term return, so that is something you need to keep in mind. If we continue to scroll down further right here, we can see all of the countries this is available in, and if we scroll down a little bit further, we can see right here dividend yield, obviously something we want to look at, sitting at 2.34%. So again, that is a little bit higher than the typical normal starting dividend yield that you'll see, but they also focus on companies that have a history of increasing their dividend payouts over time. There's a couple more things that I want to point out. So if we keep scrolling down just a little bit further right here, we can see some of the top holdings. Now this is important to understand. Some of these companies are actually still in the United States. You can see the top companies. We have companies like Microsoft and Apple. We also have Broadcom, another pretty popular dividend growth stock in the US. Now, if we jump over to SCHD and click on their holdings, one of the things you'll actually notice is they don't have Microsoft or Apple in their holdings, but if we look at DGRO, they actually do. Right here, you can see we have Microsoft and Apple listed right here. And for GGRG, we can see the top 10 holdings in this fund make up around 26% of their entire portfolio, with the remaining portfolio taking up around 73.56%. Scroll down a little bit further and we can see a quick sector breakdown. Information technology makes up around 21.7%, with healthcare around 18.5%, consumer staples around 17%, industrials around 14.69%, and consumer discretionary around 14%. Everything other than that is a little around 8% or below. If we keep scrolling down, you can see the country allocation. Now this is actually interesting. They have around 59% of their holdings still allocated to the United States. So if you do still want some exposure to the United States market, you can get that with this fund, but they also have quite a bit of exposure to countries like Switzerland, the United Kingdom, France, and Japan, as well as quite a few others. The next ETF we're going to be looking at is the Invesco QQQ Trust ETF, stock ticker QQQ. Now this is a very tech-heavy ETF, and in fact, if we go over to holdings, we can see technology makes up almost 50% of all of the holdings, and we can see Apple and Microsoft alone make up over 20% of all the holdings in this ETF, and in fact, the top 10 holdings for this ETF make up around 50% of all of the holdings within the ETF. So if we jump back over to the summary tab, we can see over the past 10 years, it has done pretty well. It's actually outperformed the S&P 500, and it has a very low starting dividend yield sitting at around 0.61%. Now the expense ratio for this one is a little bit higher than the other American ETF, sitting at 0.20% as well, so that's something to keep in mind. But if we scroll down, we can get a little more insight to how this fund operates, just like we did with the other funds. And right here, we can see it seeks to track the performance of the NASDAQ 100 index, again by using a full replication technique. So again, basically it's just a passively managed fund. And if we scroll back up, let's go ahead and look at the comparable fund for QQQ, and you can see that is going to be CNX1. Again, the objective for this fund is to basically net the total return performance of the benchmark index, which is the NASDAQ 100 index, before fees and expenses. If we scroll down a little bit more here, we can see the expense ratio for this fund is sitting at 0.33%, which again is a little bit higher than I typically like to see it, but keep in mind, even the American version had a fairly high expense ratio sitting at 0.2%, so there isn't a major difference, but it is still a little bit higher, as you can see right here. Now, if we keep scrolling down, we can see this fund is available in France, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom. If we scroll down again, we can see basically the holdings are going to be pretty much the same. We have Apple and Microsoft together making up over 20% of the entirety of this fund. Come down here a little bit further and we can see again technology making up around 50% of the entirety of this fund, communication services around 15.7%, consumer cyclical around 14%, and then anything else is pretty much below 7.5%. So there you go, those are 3 comparable funds for some of the most popular US funds. Keep in mind, I'm going to be sending out a free spreadsheet at the end of the month with more details on around 15 US funds and their comparable European funds. If you'd like to receive it, you can sign up for my free newsletter at the link in the description. Seeking Alpha is also giving anyone who signs up at my link in the description a $50 coupon and a 7-day free trial, so be sure to check that out if you're interested. So with that being said, thank you guys so much for watching, and please don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel.